Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to class. This is still Bartleby the Scrivener, a story of Wall Street, but this is a story that we've just started. So I'm sure you are all keen to know what follows in this story. What we did in the last lecture was an introduction to Herman Melville's story, and I told you that this is a story with a difference in the sense that the character of Bartleby the Scrivener is one of the most well-known characters in American literature. And this story that Melville wrote was written in the middle of the 19th century. A lot of time has elapsed since then. A lot of technological progress has been made, and nothing so clearly represents that progress in technology as this particular story, because this is a story that is based in whatever was current in the middle of the 19th century. And when you compare the setup or the environment of this story to the environment of a lawyer's office in the 21st century, you will see a few very basic differences. And that's what Melville has tried to explain to us in the first part of the story, which we covered in the last lecture. Just to quickly recap what we did in the last lecture, Bartleby the Scrivener, A Story of Wall Street, focuses on the story of scribes or clerks. The word scrivener has as its base the word scribe, which was to write, and a person who wrote was a scribe or a scrivener, from which you also have the words inscribed. The difference that you find in a lawyer's office in the 19th century and a lawyer's office in the 21st century, the primary difference you will see is that everything now is computerized, whereas everything in the 19th century was written by hand. And so the presence of the scribes is the presence of the computer assistant of the 21st century. A lot of lawyers have these clerks who help them in making up legal documents. So the narrator of Melville's story is a lawyer who has his office in Wall Street, and he gives the physical description of his environment by saying that he occupied an office in Wall Street, and this office was physically divided into two sections, in which one half of which was occupied by his two scriveners or clerks, and one runner or messenger boy, and the other half of the office was occupied by the narrator himself. The scribes were important because all these documents, and you know how long these legal documents can be and how confusing the language becomes because it's all very technical. These documents had to be copied by hand. You didn't have those photocopying facilities then. You didn't have all that computerized data. So everything had to be remembered by the clerks and had to be copied over and over again by the clerks. So Bartleby, the time at which Bartleby appears, the narrator tells us that he had been given an additional assignment, which was actually a government assignment. So when he was given this government position, he realized that the staff that he had at that moment was not sufficient. And the staff that he had at that moment comprised of those two clerks, Turkey and Nippers, and the office boy, Ginger Nut. And Melville goes into a lot of detail in describing what the temperaments of the two clerks were like. Turkey, for example, was an elderly man approaching 60, which is what the narrator describes as being his age. And Nippers was young. Turkey was very well behaved in the morning, but after 12 o'clock, his face became redder and redder. He became more irritable, and his irritation and frustration were shown in his work. So when he was copying something, he would make blots on the document. And the contrary was true of Nippers, who was bad-tempered in the morning, but very well behaved and very sedate and calm and efficient in the afternoons. So these two clerks sort of balanced each other, and in spite of the fact that the narrator had at times thought of kicking one or the other of them out, he does not do it, because for one, he realizes that when they are in good temper, they do a lot of work. They do it very efficiently. And for another, when he attacks or sort of hints to Turkey that he should perhaps be retiring now or maybe working part-time, Turkey turns around and he says that I'm not the only one who's growing old, you're also growing old. So very, very politely he tells the lawyer or his boss that I'm not the only one who should be working part-time. If I work part-time, so should you. So you see that the situation is one in which there's a lot of room for improvement, and yet because his work gets done, the narrator feels that, you know, he can deal with the situation on ground. But when he receives this additional assignment, then he advertises for another scrivener or another clerk. And one fine morning, he finds Bartleby on the threshold of his office. Regarding Bartleby, the last lecture I just gave you a little introduction, and that was that he was very sedate, very thin. He had a pallid complexion in the sense that he was very pale. He didn't have any color. Remember, Turkey is red in the face. And Bartleby is very, very pale. But because he looked so respectable, because he looked so calm and unhurried, and because he was really efficient, the narrator takes him on as an additional scribe, and he gives him a little space in a corner of his own half of the office. He puts a screen in that area so that Bartleby cannot be seen by visitors or clients who come to the office. And yet, if the narrator wants to, if the lawyer wants to, he can call Bartleby, and Bartleby can help him with whatever work that he wants done. So the last lecture we had wound up where Bartleby had just entered, and Melville had stressed the fact that he was a very efficient worker. If you gave him work, he would not rest until he had completed it. And this was regardless of the time of the day or night. So a very, very efficient worker Bartleby was proving to be. Let's see what Melville tells us about Bartleby the Scrivener in the text that we have today. It is, of course, an indispensable part of a scrivener's business to verify the accuracy of his copy word by word. Again, this is something that you can compare with the situation these days. What we have these days is attestation of certified true copy, CTC. But what they had in the 19th century was reading out of a document word for word in order to see that all copies matched the document. A very tedious job, very time consuming, and of course a lot of effort involved in verifying the accuracy of each document. These days, everything is computerized, and it's very easy to check whether a document is a certified true copy or not. What Melville points out is that it was a part of a scrivener's job not only to copy documents, but once the document had been copied, to verify it by reading aloud and checking each word. Where there are two or more scriveners in an office, they assist each other in this examination, one reading from the copy, the other holding the original. So this was the way in which this checking was done. Okay. I can readily imagine that to some sanguine temperaments it would be altogether intolerable. For example, I cannot credit the mettlesome poet Byron would have contentedly sat down with Bartleby to examine a law document of, say, 500 pages, closely written in a crimpy hand. So this is something, as I said before, which is tedious. And Melville reinforces this point by saying that this is something that only a clerk can do. It's not something that a creative artist can do. And he gives the example of the poet Byron and says, I can't imagine, Byron writing a poem, let's say Childe Harold, or let's say Keats writing Endymion, and then sitting down with Bartleby or with a scrivener and checking word for word whether the copy that had been made was a copy of the original. So in printing, it's very easy. You make a format, and then you just put that document into a machine and it brings out 10 copies or 100 copies. You have those heavy duty copiers and printers, and if you want, you can get 200 copies in 1 minute. So this is something that is a part of a scrivener's job, and it's tedious, it's time consuming, but there's nothing to be done because this is something that has to be done. Legal documents have to be attested as being certified true copies. And in the 19th century, this was a process that had to be done manually, one reading out and the other checking the original text. If it were one clerk, then the problem would be very, very huge, because it's very difficult for one man to take two documents written in what Melville calls a slightly crimpy hand, because this was all running hand, and in order to read handwriting, it needed very good eyesight. So it was a big effort on the part of those who were comparing those documents. Now and then, he says, in the haste of business, it had been my habit to assist in comparing some brief document myself. So there was a time when if the document were not very long and if the time was short, the lawyer would call the clerks out and say, okay, I'm going to assist you in doing this, let us get this done fast. So he'd call in Turkey and Nippers, or maybe both of them, and say, okay, let's do this, and do this quickly. One object I had in placing Bartleby so handy to me behind the screen was to avail myself of his services on such trivial occasions. So one reason why he put Bartleby in his part of the office was that if he needed to compare a document, then he would just call out to Bartleby and they could get this done without involving Nippers and Turkey and taking them away from the work that they were doing. So it's on the third day, he says, that being much hurried to complete a small affair I had in hand, I abruptly called to Bartleby. So Bartleby had been in office only 2 days, and on the third day, the lawyer wanted to get something done in a hurry, so he called out to Bartleby. In my haste and natural expectancy of instant compliance, I sat with my head bent over the original on my desk and my right hand sideways and somewhat nervously extended with the copy. So, he assumed that Bartleby would also fit in with the workings of his office. He had become so used to calling out to Nippers and to Turkey and to handing him the copy that he assumed that when he called out to Bartleby, Bartleby would understand what he wanted him to do. So he called out to Bartleby, and without looking up, he just extended his hand, expecting Bartleby to take that document from him. But what happened was that he kept on sitting there, and Bartleby did not respond. Now, the narrator was very surprised. He was concerned because Bartleby just called out to him and said, I would prefer not to. Now, this is something that is very difficult for the narrator to digest. Having your clerk who has been employed 2 days saying something as, let's say, as rude as denying, and yet saying it in such a way that it doesn't sound rude. So for a few moments, the narrator sits silently, not knowing how to react. And then he repeats his request. And he pays particular emphasis to the language in which he repeats it, to his enunciation. And yet, he gets the same reply. I would prefer not to. And the narrator says, prefer not to? What do you mean? Are you mad? He says, are you moonstruck? In other words, are you mad? I want you to help me complete this sheet here. Take it. And he thrusts it towards him. And Bartleby says, I would prefer not to. So he just looks at him and sees that there is no sign of anger on Bartleby's face. There's no uneasiness. There's no impatience. There's no impertinence. He's just looking at him steadily without any rudeness and without any hint of anger or impatience. Just very, very calmly he says, I would prefer not to. No anger, no excitement, nothing. And the narrator feels very sort of concerned, because scolding him at that time would be like scolding a statue. He's standing there like a statue. And just this one sentence, I would prefer not to. So he looks at him and he doesn't know what to do. This is very strange. He has not encountered such behavior before. Nippers or Turkey, he spent time with them. They know automatically what to do, and he knows how they will respond. So because he didn't have time, he called Nippers, and very quickly they just sort of went through that process of certification. A few days after this, Bartleby had finished copying 4 documents, and because they were quadruplicates, they had to be examined. They were very important legal documents that come from the High Court of Chancery, and the narrator felt that they had to be compared. So he thought that he would do it himself. He called Turkey, he called Nippers, and then he also called Ginger Nut. And what he wanted was to have the 4 of them, including Bartleby, take the copies and he should read out from the original, and they would see the document that they had and see how far it went with the original. So Turkey, Nippers and Ginger Nut each took one of the copy, and he called out to Bartleby to join them in his office. So he calls out to Bartleby, and the words that he uses is, "Bartleby, quick, I'm waiting." There's a very slow scrape of a chair being pushed back, and Bartleby appears at the entrance of this cubicle and he says, "What is wanted?" Now you have to see that when he uses very formal speech, he uses the passive voice. He doesn't say, "What do you want?" He says, "What is wanted?" because "what do you want" would sound a little rude. So the narrator says, the copies, we are going to examine them. Take this copy, sit down, and let us do it. And what does Bartleby say? "I would prefer not to." For a few moments, I was turned into a pillar of salt. Now, Bartleby refusing when there are just the two of them in the office is a different thing from Bartleby refusing when Ginger Nut, Turkey and Nippers, all three are present in the office. So the narrator, he says, it was like I was turned into a pillar of salt. I was totally motionless because I couldn't understand what he was saying. And then when it sank in that he was preferring not to in front of his entire office staff, he just got up and he went to Bartleby and said, "Why do you refuse?" And Bartleby says, "I would prefer not to. With any other man, I should have flown outright into a dreadful passion, scorned all further words, and thrust him ignominiously from my presence. But there was something about Bartleby that not only strangely disarmed me, but in a wonderful manner touched and disconcerted me. I began to reason with him." If it had been anyone else, he would probably have thrown him bodily from his office. But Bartleby did everything in such a mild manner, so softly and yet so firmly, that instead of feeling that he was being rude, the narrator started to reason with him. And he says, "This is something that you've written yourself. We are going to examine them. It is labor saving to you because one examination will answer for your 4 papers. You've done it. Your work has to be checked. So it would be easy if you were to do it yourself. It is common usage, So he's trying to reason with him and he says, "I'm not asking you to do something extraordinary. This is a part of your job. You have to certify copies that have been made. Is it not so? Will you not speak? Answer." And Bartleby says, "I would prefer not to." Each time his voice is very clear. His words are enunciated very clearly. There is no doubt or no confusion as to what he is saying or what he means. The only thing is that he is very firm and yet very polite. He doesn't say, "I will not do it." Remember, he says, "I would prefer not to." It seemed to me that while I had been addressing him, he carefully revolved every statement that I made, fully comprehended the meaning, could not gainsay the irresistible conclusion, but at the same time some paramount consideration prevailed with him to reply as he did. So it's not that he didn't understand what his boss was saying. He understood perfectly. He understood it, he weighed the pros and cons, and then he said, I would prefer not to. So the lawyer says, you are decided then not to comply with my request, a request made according to common usage and common sense. So he's trying to address reason. He's trying to point out that whatever he is saying is not unreasonable. It's something that lawyers do. It's something that clerks do all the time. They do it for each other. They do it for their own work. It is a requirement. And yet, when the narrator asks him why he will not do it, he says, I would prefer not to. And when the narrator says that is your decision irreversible, he says, yes, my decision is irreversible. I will not. He doesn't say, I will not do it. You have to remember that point very clearly. He doesn't outright reject whatever his employer is saying. His statement is a very polite one, but a very firm one. I would prefer not to. So it is not seldom the case that when a man is browbeaten in some unprecedented and violently unreasonable way, he begins to stagger in his own plainest faith. And that's what happens to the narrator now. The way in which Bartleby utters this sentence makes the narrator doubt the veracity of his own statement, makes the narrator doubt whether he heard right, whether what he said was right. So, if a disinterested person were present, the lawyer would have turned to him to ask him for reassurance, to ask him whether what he had said was so unreasonable. But as it happened, you had Turkey, Nippers and Ginger Nut in the office. So he turned around to Turkey and he says, what do you think of this? Am I not right? And Turkey says, with submission, sir, I think that you are. So this is Turkey's very polite time of the day. So he says, yes, you're right. And he then asks Nippers, and Nippers says, I think I should kick him out of the office. Remember Nippers and Turkey? When one is having his fit of frustration and irritation, the other is calm and peaceful. And it's vice versa also. So when Turkey very politely says, I think you're right in asking him to do this, Nippers says, I should kick him out of the office. And Ginger Nut, so astonished is the lawyer that he turns around to Ginger Nut, the 12-year-old boy, and he says, what do you think of it? And Ginger Nut says, I think he's a little loony. So remember, Ginger Nut is only 12 years old, so whatever he says is going to be in accordance with his age, his lack of education, and his position in the office. So Ginger Nut says, I think he's a little mad, but Ginger Nut is enjoying this situation. So the lawyer turns around to Bartleby and he says, you hear what they say? Now come out and do your duty. But Bartleby did not say anything at all, no answer whatsoever. So what they do is they have a little trouble, but the lawyer then makes use of the people that he has in the office, and so they certify the copies that have been done and get that work out of the way. But they got it out of the way not very easily, because Turkey and Nippers, they felt satisfied and they felt frustrated, and particularly Nippers, he was having his fit at that time, said that this was the last time that he was doing anyone else's work, and he was not going to do it again unless he was paid extra for it. Which of course is a strange idea, because this was still in working hours, and as such nippers had no cause to complain. But feeling that Bartleby was in the same position as them and not doing his work made both of them angry and upset. But it made no difference to Bartleby, who was oblivious of everything and was doing whatever he was doing. Some days passed, the scrivener being employed upon other lengthy work. So it's not that work stopped at any time. There was always work to be done. But this behavior of Bartleby's, it somehow stuck to his employer's mind, and he didn't he didn't know what to do with him. And then he started observing him, and what he observed was that Bartleby never went out for dinner. In fact, he never went out anywhere. Nippers and Turkey, they would go out of the office. They would go out to have food, or for their lunch break or dinner break, whatever you call it. But more and more, the lawyer started to observe that Bartleby did not ever leave the office, and this was something that was very strange for him, because they were sitting cooped up in a small office all day and all evening, and yet he observed that Bartleby never went anywhere. He was always there in his corner. He was always there. But at about 11 o'clock, he noticed that Ginger Nut would go towards the area that had been sort of cordoned off, or that had been screened off, and then he would leave the office with a few pennies, and it was assumed that this was money that had been given to him by Bartleby. And when he returned, he would reappear with a handful of those ginger nuts, or those cakes, and out of those he would be rewarded with 2, and that was how he gets his nickname of Ginger Nut. So this was what he learnt about Bartleby's eating habits. He lives then on ginger nuts, thought I, never eats a dinner, properly speaking. He must be a vegetarian then. But no, he never eats even vegetables. He eats nothing but ginger nuts. And then, he started thinking of how and why and when and what. But all this is very confusing for him, because he realizes that Bartleby doesn't eat anything apart from ginger nut. He doesn't go out for dinner. He doesn't go out at all. And so this sort of gets him thinking about Bartleby. Now, ginger nuts are so called because they contain ginger as one of their peculiar constituents and the final flavoring one. And what is ginger? Ginger is something that's hot and spicy. Was Bartleby hot and spicy? Not at all. Ginger then had no effect upon Bartleby. Probably he preferred it should have none. So you see how he sort of starts to get into that same mode of speech. He starts thinking about his eating habits, realizes that Bartleby doesn't eat anything apart from ginger nuts, thinks of what constitutes a ginger cake, and realizes that Bartleby's temperament stays the same no matter what is said to him, no matter what is done around him, no matter what he eats. Nothing appears to have any effect on him. He stays the same. Nothing so aggravates an earnest person as a passive resistance. So this resistance that he encounters from Bartleby is a passive resistance. And he goes on to say, if the individual so resisted be of a not inhumane temper, and the resisting one perfectly harmless in his passivity, then in the better moods of the former he will endeavour charitably to construe to his imagination what proves impossible to be solved by his judgment. So Bartleby's employer is a little confused, because Bartleby is not being rude. There's nothing in the tone of his voice which shows that he is being rude. His words, if you analyze them, are very polite. His tone is very polite, but the tone is firm. There can be no change in Bartleby's attitude, in Bartleby's tone. Even so, for the most part, I regarded Bartleby and his ways. So he still thinks about Bartleby in a very sort of confused frame of mind, because he's not being impertinent, he's not being rude, and yet he's not obeying instructions. So the narrator says that I could still sort of sympathize with him, because I realized that he did not go anywhere, no one came to meet him, and he doesn't eat much. So he says he's useful to me, I can get along with him. If I turn him away, the chances are he will fall in with some less indulgent employer, and then he will be rudely treated and perhaps driven forth miserably to starve. So by now the narrator has realized that Bartleby doesn't have much money. He doesn't spend anything. He doesn't have anywhere to go to. He doesn't have anyone who comes to him. So he sort of starts to feel that he is doing a good deed by keeping Bartleby here, because if he were to turn him out, the next person to employ Bartleby might not be in such a magnanimous mood, might not put up with the vagaries of his nature. So to befriend Bartleby, to humour him in his strange willfulness, will cost me little or nothing. Because you have to remember that he is a very good worker. He does the copy work that he has been employed for. It is only apart from those things that he refuses to obey his employer. And so he sort of feels that he will be satisfying his conscience by keeping Bartleby in the present position, and not throwing him out because he prefers not to do certain things. But then, you know, this is something that is very easy to say. It's not so easy to practice in the long term. And sometimes he says the passiveness of Bartleby irritated me. I felt strangely goaded on to encounter him in new opposition, to elicit some angry spark from him answerable to my own. But indeed I might as well have essayed to strike fire with my knuckles against a bit of Windsor soap. One afternoon, anyway, let's go back a bit. So he says that although I made up my mind that I was not going to throw Bartleby out of the office, yet it was difficult for me to keep that resolve. And there were times when I felt that I would like to get some kind of an emotional response from him, maybe a change of tone in his voice. But he says that this was something impossible. Whatever I said, if Bartleby was willing to do it, he would do it. If he didn't want to do it, he would just utter that one statement, I would prefer not to, and that was it. He never showed angry, he never showed any emotion whatsoever. And with the passage of time, the narrator says, one fine afternoon, you know, I was sort of goaded into provoking a response from him. And then he describes a scene that ensued. He says, Bartleby, when those papers are all copied, I will compare them with you. And Bartleby gives the standard response, I would prefer not to. How? Surely you do not mean to persist in that mulish vagary? And he says nothing. So something comes on to the narrator, and he wants to provoke Bartleby. He wants to get an angry response from him. He wants him to show some form of emotion, but Bartleby is not willing to do that. And because this is a time when Turkey and Nippers are both there, they are listening to the conversation that is going on. And so he addresses both of them and he says, look at him, he says he won't examine his papers. What do you think of it, Turkey? Now, this was the afternoon, and you remember in the afternoon, Turkey was in a foul mood. So he was already, red-faced and very angry and very irritated. So he says, think of it, I think I'll just step behind his screen and black his eyes for him. So this is the bad time of the day to be asking Turkey for any opinion. And when the narrator puts out that question, Turkey is the first one to respond. So he responds, and his response is a very angry one. And he gets up at once and sort of takes up a stance like he's going to go and box Bartleby's ears for him. But his employer says, sit down, Turkey, and then he asks Nippers, what do you think of it, Nippers? Would I not be justified in immediately dismissing Bartleby? And Nippers, because it's the time of the day when he's in a very calm and placid state of mind, he says, excuse me, that is for you to decide, sir. I think his conduct quite unusual and indeed unjust as regards Turkey and myself, but it may be only a passing whim. So what Turkey says is countered by what Nippers says. And so the narrator says, you have strangely changed your mind then. You speak very gently of him now. And Turkey says, it's beer. It's because he drinks beer that Nippers is very gentle. So this is a sort of conversation that's going on with the three of them participating. And you see that when one is angry, the other is in a very calm frame of mind. The narrator still doesn't know what to do, so he closes those doors, that is, dismisses the ideas of Turkey and Nippers, and once again advances towards Bartleby, saying that, seeing that Bartleby never left the office, he says, Bartleby, Ginger Nut is away, just step round to the post office, won't you, and see if there's anything for me. Now, the narrator is somewhat in a state of mind where he wants to goad Bartleby to respond with a rude reply. So once he sees that Nippers and Turkey have balanced each other, he comes again to Bartleby's corner of the office and says, Ginger Nut is away. Why don't you go around to the post office and see if there's any mail for me? And he gets the standard response, I would prefer not to. You will not? And Bartleby says, I prefer not. Now this totally floors his employer. He staggers to his desk and he just sits there because Bartleby is not rude. Bartleby's words, Bartleby's tone are very, very polite. He prefers not to. Even when he's goaded into saying, I will not, he says, I prefer not. So that word prefer makes everything more polite, and yet there's a firmness that is not to be disregarded. So he calls out, says, Bartleby, and there's no answer. Bartleby, no answer. That sort of, brings out the worst in the lawyer, and he roars, Bartleby! And at the third summons, Bartleby appears at the corner of his hermitage, as he calls him, because he doesn't come out of that corner. So he appears at last, and when his employer, when the narrator, the lawyer, says, go to the next room and tell Nippers to come to me, he gets the standard reply, I prefer not to. So he says, very good, Bartleby. And this is the time when he sort of makes up his mind to do something about Bartleby, and yet he responds in a very unusual manner, and he doesn't get angry with him, and just thinks that maybe I should put on my hat and walk home for the day, because he's so confused, he's totally confused, and he just doesn't know how to deal with Bartleby. Because if he were being rude, then there would be no objection to him throwing him out of the office. But he's a very good copier, he's a very good clerk. The only thing is that he has certain set ideas, what you would call these days a job description that he has given himself, and beyond that he will not go, he will not budge. And he turns down all these instructions, not in a rude manner, but very, very politely. And it is this politeness, this firmness of resolve that confuses his employer. Shall I acknowledge it? The conclusion of this whole business was that it soon became a fixed fact of my chambers that a pale young scrivener by the name of Bartleby and had a desk there that he copied for me at the usual rate of 4 cents a folio, but he was permanently exempt from examining the work done by him, that duty being transferred to Turkey and Nippers. And this is moreover that Bartleby was never on any account to be dispatched on the most trivial errand of any sort, and that even if entreated on any account to be dispatched on the and that even if entreated to take upon him such a matter, it was generally understood that he would prefer not to. In other words, that he would refuse point blank. So with the passage of time, the confusion in the narrator's mind increases because, he's a lawyer. There are people who come to his office, and plus the fact that Nippers, Ginger Nut and Turkey go out and meet other people. So very soon it came to be known that there was this young man who was a scrivener in the office, and yet he would not do everything that he was commanded to. Now the job of a clerk was such that they really could not refuse to do anything that their employers or anything that their bosses wanted, because the clerks did not have the education to be lawyers, did not have the money to study to become lawyers. So because their jobs were of a rather menial kind, they could not afford to say no to anything that the lawyer wanted, because they were there in the capacity of an assistant to the lawyer. And therefore there was absolutely no concept of saying no to what was wanted, and yet it was soon spread amongst the legal community that there was this one clerk who copied at the usual rate, and he gives you this rate, and he says that that was the only thing that he would do. He would not examine the copies made by him. He would not run errands, whereas all the other clerks, if and when such an opportunity arose, or if and when they were asked to do other work, they would very quietly do it. They would not have the courage or the audacity to deny their employer anything at all. So this is the kind of sort of reputation that he has now, because of this additional duty that has been given to him, because he is master in chancery. Therefore, there were a lot of people who were coming to his office. A lot of people were anxious and curious to know what was going on in his office. So this kind of an exciting news spread very fast amongst the legal fraternity. And with the passage of days, there was some confusion that was increased, and then there were, on the other hand, the narrator becomes sort of used to Bartleby's behavior. His steadiness, his freedom from all dissipation, his incessant industry, his great stillness, his unalterableness of demeanor under all circumstances made him a valuable acquisition. So when he weighed the pros and cons, he realized that Bartleby was always there. He was never late. He never went early. He didn't take long dinner hours. And he did all the copying that was given to him. The only thing that he did not do is run errands. He did what he felt was his job, and apart from that, he would not do it. The only time that the narrator had sort of seen him do anything other than copying, he was standing behind his screen. He was just standing looking at the wall. Now that is something that really perplexes his employer, and that really confuses him. Apart from that, he was satisfied with him. He was honest. He did not waste any of the time that he was supposed to spend in doing his work. The only thing that he did apart from copying was that sometimes he would just stand behind his screen and just be looking at a wall. He didn't seem to be doing anything. He was always there, but it was just that he would be standing there. He was a very honest person, and his employer felt very confident that he could trust Bartleby with the most important papers. Sometimes he became angry with him, and he would want to elicit some form of response from Bartleby, but he was never really able to get any kind of a response from Bartleby apart from this one sentence which was rephrased in many different ways, and that is, "I would prefer not to." Now, I'm going to stop here, but before I leave you people, I'd like to go back quickly over what we have done today. We've started the story Bartleby the Scrivener, a story of Wall Street, written by Herman Melville, and this story was written in the middle of the 19th century, 1853 to be specific. Melville is one of the 19th century short story writers. He's also written novels, and the style that he has adopted for this is a slightly formal one, because you have to remember that he was writing in the 19th century, and even the conversation that he has, because it's taking place A, in the 19th century, and B, it's taking place in a sort of in what I would call not exactly a legal environment, but in an environment which has a lot to do with the law and with the courts of justice. So Bartleby is a scrivener, a scribe, a clerk, a copyist, and he comes to the lawyer's office when the narrator, who is a lawyer, gets an additional assignment to serve in the capacity of master in chancery, and his work is increased. So he employs Bartleby in his office, although he already has 2 clerks and an office boy. The clerks are named Turkey and Nippers, and the office boy is called Gingernut. All 3 names are not their original names, but are nicknames given to them because of the way they behave and because of the way they appear. So Bartleby starts work in the office and is a very efficient copyist, with the only difference that when he feels he doesn't want to do anything, he refuses very politely and very calmly. He does not get angry, he is not outright rude, he doesn't defy his boss, but he expresses his own ideas in a very firm manner. So whenever he is asked to do something that he does not want to, his response, his standard response is, I would prefer not to. He doesn't get angry, he doesn't become rude, he just says, I would prefer not to. With the passage of time, his boss comes to accept him, but even so, there are times when he sort of wants to force a response from him, wants Bartleby to respond in a rude manner or in an angry manner, and so he puts propositions before Bartleby. He will tell him to go and fetch something or tell him to go and call something, and then he would be given this response of, I would prefer not to. And because he has this very important government assignment, there comes a time when people around him or the legal fraternity, they also know that there is a clerk or there is a copyist in his office who copies at the standard rate, but who will not do anything else. He will not run errands, he will not examine the copies that he has made, but he will only do work that he thinks should be done or that he thinks is his job, and he refuses to do anything else. But his refusal is couched in such polite phrases that his employer cannot find fault with him. Plus the fact that he is a very honest man, he does not take long breaks. In fact, he doesn't seem to go out anywhere. The only time when his employer sees him doing something other than copy work is when he stands sort of in a reverie behind his screen, and his employer is at a loss to understand what he sees or what he thinks about, because Bartleby is not an easy person to talk with. He is, you wouldn't say he's antisocial, but he does not converse with like other people. He doesn't talk like other people. He doesn't act like other people. And one of the most important things is that all that he has the whole day to eat is a few ginger cakes. That's all that he's ever seen to consume. The others, they go out and have meals, they have people coming to see them, but nobody comes to see Bartleby. Bartleby does not go out anywhere. And this is something that stays within his employer's mind. It's a plus point for him because he doesn't have to worry about people coming to see him in the office. But there are moments when he sort of gets upset by the fact that Bartleby seems to be alone in the world. He suits him because he's honest, because he does all the work in record time, and he can entrust Bartleby with the most important of all documents without thinking that there would be any mess up in some ways. So we'll end here and we'll do some more in the next class. Thank you very much for being such patient listeners, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Allah Hafiz.